For the final session of day one of the 2024 Widening the Pipeline finale, when I was a young reporter, my number one goal was to win a Pulitzer Prize. I wanted to, as I've told Bradford, be an editorial writer. I thought maybe I could be a local columnist, but the ultimate goal was to win that award. I thought that would confer something onto me. At this point in my life, the prize and the award, as far as I'm concerned, has been my work training young journalists on the African continent and now in the US. But I thought it was important for you all to meet someone who has achieved that accomplishment, who has produced journalism that is acknowledged by her peers as the best of the best. But to have her talk with you about what might be more important than awards and prizes, and that is committing to journalism, finding your passion, and living it out. So we are very privileged at this point to have as our keynote speaker Silvia Foster-Frau. She is a reporter, a national investigative reporter with the Washington Post. And she writes about how local, state, and federal governments are serving this country's diversifying population. But more importantly, Silvia and her colleagues won a Pulitzer Prize this past year for their reporting on mass shootings and AR-15 style weapons. Silvia, thank you so much for coming today and for sharing your insights with Widening the Pipeline Fellows.
Thank you for having me, and what a wonderful group to speak to. Excited.
So one of the reasons I'm most excited about having you here is that I saw the speech you gave after the prize was announced and you were speaking to the newsroom. And I know you've produced a presentation for us, but before you get to it, I want you to take us to that moment of you standing there talking about the investigation, talking about your team. What did it mean for you at this point in your career to be part of a Pulitzer Prize winning team?
Wow, what did it mean to me? I mean, it was a surreal experience because I too, once I realized that journalism was what I wanted to do, saw that as kind of the pinnacle of your career, and ascribed a lot of meaning to what it meant to win a Pulitzer, and thought that that would be kind of almost the ultimate validation of who I was as a journalist and my work ethic and my skill set. And it's funny, when I found out the news and was like absorbing and processing it, I felt so proud of my younger self, because when I was young and wanting to be a journalist, I didn't have a lot of examples of that in my bubble of the universe. And it sounded so far away, just like so unimaginably out of reach. And so to have then gone through the years of life and just, doing the day in and out of reporting, to have wound up eventually where, getting to a point where you realize, oh, I'm at the Washington Post. This is where people who win Pulitzer Prizes are from, where they work, and then working on a project where there's this buzz about it could be a Pulitzer Prize, getting to that point where that's the new bubble that you're in, that's the reality that you're living in, is just, I was just kind of blown away by that journey, and by the fact that I had, been able to have that dream and came through on the other end of it, and it's funny because even though that was a dream when I was younger, it's not like that was something that I thought about every day. I loved journalism. I loved getting to meet so many different kinds of people and learning about all sorts of aspects of life and dropping into events and groups and communities that I never would have otherwise. And I got so wrapped up into that it almost, in some weird way, had less meaning when I got the Pulitzer Prize, because I already by that point knew I loved to do, knew what my passion was. And that's like really what you want at the end of the day. You want to be doing something that you care about. And so then the rest almost feels like it's nice, right? It's a nice bonus to that, I guess, but it's not, it's a little bit superfluous to like the actual substance of life, if that makes sense.
That's the sweet spot as journalists you need to get to, in my opinion. The work that you're doing is so important, so meaningful to you, so fulfilling to you, that the award is nice. But as Sylvia just said, it's, you've long since achieved what you came into this business to achieve, which is you're reporting the stories, you're telling the stories, and that's what matters. I'm going to turn it over to you right now, and I'm going to let you take the lead in this discussion.
Oh, all right. So I just put together a little presentation to kind of walk through briefly how the stories that ended up being award-winning stories came to be. And so with the first slide, I wanted to start with some of the work I did when I was first starting out in journalism. So it started with covering fires. I was like a breaking news reporter in Connecticut. That was my first job out of college. So I'm from the Midwest. I'm part Puerto Rican. And my first job I got was in Greenwich Time, Connecticut, which if you've heard of Greenwich, it's one of the wealthiest areas in the country. It's on the East Coast. It was like a completely new experience for me. I felt like I was going like on a study abroad mission when I was there. This like Puerto Rican from like small town Midwest driving this old beat up Buick all the way to Connecticut, and I was covering breaking news and doing just all sorts of random stuff like fires in small towns and things like that. And then in my second year, I went to the San Antonio Express News where I was for 5 years. And same kind of thing, like I was covering one-off mall shootings, and I started an education beat that I got into and worked hard on. But through those steps, I began to kind of try to show my skill set, show that I was good on deadline, kind of proving myself to editors that I could, do profiles of victims and make a story that is maybe small, worthwhile enough to fill the paper, because we're working at these small papers where like the main goal is like we need to fill the paper every day. I was doing stuff like interviewing bananas in the city of San Antonio. So really just getting like a broad range of experience covering all sorts of things. And it kind of all led to this moment in 2017 where there was a mass shooting in Sutherland Springs, Texas. And that's on the next slide. I was working a Sunday shift. I was doing like a shift. I would work Sundays through Thursdays and would help cover breaking news. I was still very kind of entry-level reporter. And that Sunday, I got a call from my editor that there was an active shooter in Sutherland Springs, Texas. Had never heard of the town, didn't know what it was. I just happened to be on duty that day. I was actually covering doing a very small feature on some annual fair that was in town. Again, filling the paper. And so I grabbed a burger from Whataburger because had not eaten yet, and then raced down to this small town in Sutherland Springs, Texas. And, sometimes when there's an active shooter, it doesn't end up being anything. Nobody gets shot, nobody gets killed, everything's fine. But in this case, it was a very different story. And I got there, and there were ambulances and police cars and people's bodies being pulled out of this small church in Sutherland Springs. And so this was the first, or go back for one sec. This was the first story I did on that community. And I had staked out in front of a gas station next to the church. This community has 600 to 800 people. It's very small. And found the uncle of Ryland Ward, who survived after getting shot. I think it was 8 times, 6, 7, 8 times, and who had lost several family members, and who had helped pull bodies out of the church and identify them for law enforcement. And so I wrote on deadline this story that night that then published in the paper the next day. And that started this what basically became a beat for me of covering this community as it recovered from a mass shooting. 26 people were killed in this small church, including children, parents, grandparents. One man, John Holcomb, lost 3 children, his pregnant wife, both of his parents, his brother, and his niece in the shooting. And the gunman who killed himself after the shooting was the husband of a woman whose family attended the church. So people knew him, and he was part of the community. So that was my first story, and it basically changed the whole focus because I became this kind of go-to reporter for covering this story. And as a local reporter, you stay a lot longer usually than national reporters do, right? Like, you stick with it. It's in your backyard. It's the people that you write for that are affected by it. And so I stuck with this story and kind of made myself the main person. I was going down to Sutherland Springs, which is about 45 minutes away, every single day to get to know the community, to find out more stories, and to keep covering them. So for the next slide, you can see this is August 2018. So this is 10 months after the shooting happened. I landed a big exclusive interview with the wife of the gunman. And we interviewed her extensively. He had killed her, or he had killed his mother-in-law and had killed several people that were very close to her. And she has 2 children who was the father of. And I spoke to her about if there were signs that he was a mass shooter, what happened that day. He had tied her up in her room and gone to commit the mass shooting while her children were there. I mean, just really crazy, horrific stuff. She also strangely, it wasn't strange, but she also still loved him. He was the father of her children. And so it was also one of the first, most ethically complicated stories I ever did. She was a victim of domestic violence by him. And so she had kind of these changing, in the interview, moments of love for him and hate for him. And so trying to weave that into a story and respect that this is a woman who's still processing this insane and horrific event was going through it was a life-changing experience. But again, it developed it was almost a reflection of this very strong connection I had with the community now, that she trusted me to tell her story. She had other family members vouching for me as a reporter that she could trust and rely on, and I kept those connections strong. We invited several of the community members to go to the San Antonio Express News to tour the newsroom and show them how it was done. So we kind of formed that bond. Fast forward then, I get hired by the Washington Post. I think I'm probably not going to be able to tell this community story anymore. I'm now a national reporter. My beat isn't really focused on mass shootings, though I do end up on a team that covers a lot of mass shootings. The Post kind of quickly realized that I had this experience and were sending me out to cover breaking news, but this time as a national reporter, right, which is very different. You don't get to kind of form those long bonds. And then an editor presented this idea about doing a story on AR-15 style rifles and the role that they play in mass shootings. And I immediately jumped on board and had these connections to tell the story of Sutherland Springs. And the whole kind of conceit of this story was, we don't often follow up 5 years later on what happened to that community after a mass shooting. And I learned things that I didn't even realize because, you keep connections with people, but you're not necessarily talking to them in a reporter's way and going at it with a certain angle of asking the right questions. And I learned that several of the community members had lead poisoning because of the fragments of bullets that stayed in their bodies, and women became infertile. They can't have children because of the lead toxicity. That's not something you hear about, right, as a consequence for survivors in mass shootings. And often, actually, survivors are not talked about enough, right? We talk a lot about the victims and profile them, but what happens to the people who are so broken by it mentally, emotionally, physically? So I did this story. It came out in March of 2023. It was a lot of those same community members that I had kept in touch with, and I was really happy after doing a lot of breaking news for the Post to be able to take a step back and do something a little more in depth. And then several months later was when we published Terror on Repeat, which was kind of the project that we submitted to the Pulitzers was a series that included my previous story, but Terror on Repeat was really kind of, it was an explosive piece because we made a lot of new decisions as a newsroom. We published previously unpublished photographs from scenes of mass shootings. And something that kind of not aided, but was a reasoning for why we showed what we chose to show, was as we were exploring this idea of like, why don't we show more of mass shootings, and what is that line of how much you should be showing or not. On the one hand, you need to respect and honor and be sensitive to the families and the victims and the people involved. On the other hand, like, what are we shielding the public from that they should know? And this was at the same time that the Israel-Gaza conflict had really started to come into full view, where newsrooms across the country were publishing photographs of unidentifiable children that were destroyed from warfare and in war zones and conflict. And we were showing bodies and blood and stuff, but it's foreign, right? It's a war abroad. And it really started to make us think, well, why aren't we showing the wars that are here at home, that are happening in our elementary schools, in our churches, in our grocery stores, that are happening all the time, every day, yet some reason as media, we choose not to show those. We say, oh, it's too sensitive. We shouldn't expose people to that, or we can't identify them, so we shouldn't. And so we started thinking about whether we needed to disrupt that sort of status quo and not only show those things, but also take unorthodox steps in involving the community members in the production and publishing of the story. And so relying on interviews I had done with the Sutherland Springs community and with 10 other communities of mass shootings, we put together this piece that weaves together 11 mass shootings over 11 years. They were all caused by a man wielding an AR-15 style rifle. And we took quotes. One of the things we noticed when we started looking at all the images we had and all the quotes we had and putting them together was how similar they all were, right? Like quotes from one survivor's account or one law enforcement's account of seeing children in an elementary school's bodies piled up, like perfectly matched descriptions from other shootings. It was really eerie how similar they were, and really showed to us how often history was repeating itself. But we get caught up in these news cycles where we're covering it once and then we cover it again the same way and we cover it again and we tell the same stories over and over again. And so we really wanted to show this pattern, like we are doing this, like the same thing is happening over and over again in America. And so we interweaved quotes from all these different folks over a period of 11 years and interweaved photos to show the connections between the two, and basically told the story using quotes and photographs of like a single mass shooting and walked people through it. And so I want to play this top part. I would like to put a warning, like if you are sensitive to, there's no body shown. This is at the very beginning of the article when you just start to view, we kind of let readers, we build up to it. But there should be a play button if you can find it. Yeah. So that's from the Las Vegas mass shooting. That's Sutherland Springs, photos we obtained from the lawyers of the families. And that's in Uvalde, those are body bags. We have an intro where we kind of describe the story. And then we start with part one. We walk people through videos. Again, see it's quotes that kind of build up, showing different images. That was just a small sample. So just a few things to point out about this. This was the project that won the Pulitzer Prize. And as you can see, this wasn't like a one-off experience for me, right? Like my whole career unintentionally had kind of been building to these types of stories, right? And I was also very lucky at this point to be in a newsroom that had these kinds of resources. This, as you can see, is not a single byline story, and it's not just a traditional written out story. It's has multimedia. We had a whole design team on it. We had folks who do video editing to do captions on it and editing it down and producing it. We had meetings constantly, including with the higher ups and several different teams to make sure the design matched the photos, matched the quotes, and putting it all together. We had a whole, this also came out in print, so then we had a completely other different version of this for what this would look like in print. So it was also that I had come to a place that had the resources to be able to pull something like this off, right? The skill set was, for me, the same exact skill set that I'd had for years. It's the same skills and the same kind of work that I had been doing in San Antonio and in Connecticut. It was just now with this much bigger team, with many different resources, and with the luxury of time, right? Because I wasn't having to cover, when we worked on this story, I didn't have to cover breaking news. I was able to fully immerse myself in this project and give myself the mental space and ability and time to do that. So that was really all. I just kind of wanted to walk through because I feel like when I imagine people winning the Pulitzer Prize, it's like from 0 to 100, and you don't really see like all of the things that happen in between, right? All the ways that like different life experience and working in different newsrooms, and also all the resources and teams that are put together that enable for something like this to happen. If I had devised this idea on my own at a smaller paper, we would not have had the resources to produce this, and what would have been produced probably would not have won a Pulitzer Prize. And so I say this all to say that it really, going back to our initial point, was about the journalism and the work along the way, right? Like my attachment to that community and that kind of storytelling and that issue of mass shootings that was the main kind of driver in my career.
It's a powerful example of the fact that everything we do in our careers can come full circle. And so we may be in a moment where it's chasing trending news. I'm so over it. I'm burnt out. I'm tired or whatever. But if we keep that larger vision in mind, it makes sense. I know that's what I feel every day. I want to ask you something, and I'll open it up for questions soon, but again, as a young reporter, I always thought that places like the New York Times and the Washington Post were these mystical, magical places where there's a lot of stuff to consider about management and, one up and competing with people. So give us some insights into how all the skills and experiences that you had in San Antonio and elsewhere came into play when you got to the Post and had to navigate that newsroom. What was that like?
So it was a lot bigger than what I was used to, and I still don't have a complete sense of all of the operations there by any means. Also didn't help that I started like shortly after the pandemic when things are kind of weird anyway. But I will say that I've met incredible journalists at every single newspaper that I've worked at, and I've met plenty of journalists who don't work at the Washington Post that could easily be stars at the Washington Post, and vice versa. I think, and I also discovered that the work itself kind of remained the same. The stakes are higher because more people are reading it. So you feel kind of the weight and responsibility more of what you're putting out there. But really, like the work itself was not any different than what I had done at any other newsroom.
So keeping that focus on the work is so important. I've got a quick question here, so I'll go ahead and
Hi, I'm Brianna. I work at Michigan Radio, and I we've been talking about pivoting a little bit today, so I wanted to ask you kind of how you made the decision to pivot to the Washington Post, and also what did that look like? Did you just see a listing online and you're like, oh, I'm going to go for it? How'd you talk yourself through that? Did you apply any other places and not get it? I feel like that's what we're all kind of struggling with now. What does it look like to get to those places, and like literally how? So
yeah, so a couple things. So I had started to feel like I was I was doing very well where I was at. I had kind of established this line of reporting with my mass shooting experience, and I was also an immigration reporter by that point for the San Antonio Express News, and felt like at the time it was under the Trump administration and was really competing against other national reporters and trying to break immigration stories. But I applied. I saw the Washington Post rolled out a series of roles after the George Floyd murder, and a lot of them were geared toward race and ethnicity. And as I mentioned before, I'm Puerto Rican and had always had a passion for covering race and ethnicity in America. And they had one for multiculturalism reporter. And as a Puerto Rican from the Midwest, from the rural Midwest, it really fit perfectly with what I cared about. And I felt like it was kind of meant for me to write about the kind of changing diversity of America and be able to write enterprise stories. And so I applied. I also, I was a member of NHJ, the Hispanic Journalists Organization, and I had met a couple folks that worked at the Washington Post. One was a recruiter at the Washington Post. And I let everyone know, any little connection I had, I let them know that I was applying for that. And, got the ear of some people who might have advice for what to write and kind of the essay about it and stuff like that. And I applied, and months went by, and long story short, I ended up getting it. And so for me, actually, I should back up. I had applied like a year earlier for a Washington Post assignment that was like a general assignment reporter position. And they called me back and we started talking. And at the end, I was getting close. They didn't give me an offer yet, but as I learned more and more about what exactly the position was, I ended up not taking it. Because at that point I was doing these really long form pieces on immigration and enterprise stories and getting into investigative stuff a little bit more. And I didn't want to have to return to doing daily kind of online. It was for like a position that did kind of like online, interesting, quirky stuff for the Washington Post. And at that point I wasn't interested in going back to that. And even though I was like really taken by the Washington Post brand and name and like, really, like I remember just getting on the phone and I was like, this person works at the Washington Post. They work at the Washington Post. Like I was really freaking out about it. I was like, my time will come. I didn't have enough faith. They had told me, oh, well, everyone who starts in this position in a few years works their way up to, what they really want to do. But at least for me, I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna wait. Because I do love the kind of work I'm doing now. And I decided to not be taken kind of by the shininess of the name and just hope that like at some point down the line, it would work out in my favor. And in that instance, that actually came true because then they rolled out the multiculturalism position and I applied for that and I got it. And that was on the national staff and it was on this America Desk team, which is what all the national correspondents work. And it was a dream job, and I didn't know. And I remember being so worried, like, did I just make the worst decision? Like, in what world do I live in? Do I think that I can turn down the Washington Post, Like, I felt kind of like, am I being dumb? I wasn't totally sure, But it was a good lesson for me that you don't always know kind of what's coming down the line. And I think that was an example of sticking true to like what I really cared about and what my passion was, and I knew that what I was doing, even if I felt like I could climb or wanted to climb, like I knew what I was doing was like the type of work I wanted to do. And that ended up kind of paying off in the long run.
I'm going to jump in here because I can. Give it to you've mentioned a couple of times being a Puerto Rican from the Midwest. And by the way, I'm from Cairo, Illinois. And I know you're
Oh,
from Galesburg,
Galesburg.
Illinois, right? Right. So one of the things we're big on in this program is lived experience and having speakers share that aspect of their lives and how it impacted their course of their career. Lori Montenegro started our day off today, and she talked about being an Afro-Latina from Cuba, and in the industry, and how at one point someone told her, well, if you're going to go work for those Mexicans, they're not going to listen to you because you're a black, Latina or whatever. But I want to talk about your experience growing up in the Midwest, growing up in Illinois. I have my own set of experiences and how people have responded or treated me or whatever. But talk a little bit about that aspect.
Yeah, so I definitely felt like our family were kind of outsiders to our community, and it's actually something that now I've come to really value. It obviously presents its challenges, growing up especially, but now I see that it offered me this really unique perspective and ability to kind of move between different worlds that I think really has benefited me as a reporter. And yeah, I also have struggled with kind of the question. I really wanted to cover race-related issues and immigration, but I have felt sometimes like, is that almost like the stereotypical thing to do? And I noticed early on there kind of was an expectation to cover those kinds of things when people learned that I was Puerto Rican and speak Spanish, but at the same time, it competed with this a genuine desire I had of my own to cover our communities better and in a more nuanced way, and be able to use my Spanish, which growing up was sometimes an embarrassment and now feels like such a blessing. And I was lucky too that I have parents who both wanted me and my brother to learn Spanish and really like celebrated our culture and heritage in a way that is not always the case in other families. And so I think that that sense that I always had even growing up, that this was something that I could be proud of and should use to my benefit, really did come through in my reporting. And I've questioned before, like, you start to second guess, like, am I doing this because that was the expectation of people, or am I doing this because I genuinely care about it and want to? And I have discovered that I do genuinely care about it and like want to cover those issues. But I think it's something that everyone, like, it's case by case, that you have to personally understand for yourself. And I always, like, a very strong advocate of covering like all sorts of different beats and trying out all different kinds of reporting to figure out like what that thing is that you're passionate about.
How did your family wind up in Galesburg?
So my mom's Puerto Rican. My dad is like from a farming family in Iowa. And my dad got a position teaching in Galesburg, and they moved down there and they just stayed there ever since. My dad speaks Spanish fluently, and so does my mom. And so we just kind of grew up there. And it's interesting now in Galesburg, this is like way much of an aside, but there's a historic Mexican community there too from the old railroads. And there's been a growing recognition of the role that this small Mexican community has played over the generations in the Midwest. And so one of the kind of undercovered issues that I really wanted to explore in that multiculturalism beat was the growth of communities of color in the Midwest, and also just the lack of representation in those areas of communities of color. And I think we saw that especially in the George Floyd, the marches and rallies and protests after George Floyd, that small towns everywhere. I mean, you could really see that diversity in Galesburg, Illinois and stuff, in the rising of that. And so, yeah, that's how we ended up there. And
Let's go to Idly.
Hi.
Aditi, excuse me.
I'm Aditi. I work for CNN. One thing that I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned that you were on the multicultural a culturalism beat, and then this project series happened. In the vein of pivoting, I kind of want to know more about how that worked for you organizationally. Were you asked to participate in the project, or did you hear about it and you said you wanted to participate in it? And also, as you did get assigned to it, how did the conversation with your manager go and all of that?
Yeah, so I know it's kind of confusing. So I got the role of multiculturalism reporter, and it was on this national correspondence team that also was in charge of responding to like national breaking news. Mostly the correspondence. So if like breaking news happened in Texas, like the Texas correspondents would cover it, but it also ended up usually involving other people on the team. So I kind of had this weird thing where I was doing enterprise stories for multiculturalism, but I was also becoming one of their, like, I would respond a lot to the mass shooting breaking news. And so like half my time ended up being dedicated to flying out somewhere and covering it. And I covered, like, for the Washington Post alone, I covered more than maybe like 7 or 8 or more mass shootings for them, flying out, doing the coverage, doing follow-up, stuff like that. And so I kind of was still existing in these two worlds. And I think I was in some ways, at least in the newsroom, making more of a name for myself in the coverage of mass shootings, just because it was, especially at that time, just so constant. And I was often a point person for that coverage. And so when the project came along, it was already like kind of a natural fit for me because of my coverage. And now I'm an investigative reporter. So during the process of that series, I got this new beat of investigative reporter. So this year I've actually pivoted and been doing something completely different about access to safe drinking water in the US. And that's been my like main focus and series of stories all this year as an investigative reporter. So like just a small note I would say about that, like whatever it is, if you have an idea of something you want to cover and it's not what you're covering now, I would find like any little way you can to begin incorporating that into your beat. Like when I was an education reporter and I really wanted to be an immigration reporter, I found all the ways I could to sneak that in, basically. Like I was writing about undocumented teachers, kids who were learning English as a second language, like constantly showing that I could write about that. And so when the current immigration reporter would need a second hand, it would be me. And then when that current immigration reporter left, they just tapped me. I didn't even have to like make a, walk into a room and like make a big pitch about it. Like it was almost just like an easy, natural fit. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in again. Since you mentioned that this year you've been working on a project about safe drinking water, access to safe drinking water, was that a mindful sort of intentional pivot away from, you've seen some horrible things. You've experienced and talked to people who've been through horrible things. And another of our themes in the fellowship program is protecting our mental health, protecting our well-being, and knowing when we've got too much going on. So I wonder if that was a part of a strategy of you to just sort of take a break.
Yeah, I definitely needed a break after writing that series and working so intensely on those stories. It was a conversation with me and my editors about, once I knew that I would be able to take on this new role as an investigative reporter, what that could be. And it was actually one of my editors who had suggested access to safe drinking water. And I was passionate about the issue already. And it did feel like, people are dying from lack of access to safe drinking water here in the US, but it's not, this kind of dying. It's a little less graphic. In some ways it can be more insidious because it is kind of like a more chronic, slow, silent killer in certain communities throughout the country. But yes, it was definitely also an intentional, for me, break, because this was really heavy and it was hard and I had nightmares and I really struggled to process it and stay just kind of like stay calm and core to myself. You get you start to realize how vulnerable life is when you're constantly absorbed in what these stories, and you realize like how easily it could be you or your family members. And you do experience a lot of the secondhand trauma. Like even now when there's like loud noises in busy places, like I feel that I've heard too much, I've seen too much to not feel that like moment where I wonder if it's a mass shooting, you know? And so, yeah, this year has really been just like a great break from that.
Where's the mic? Give it to Michael.
So I'm Michael Lee, previously a K through 12 reporter at Salt Lake Tribune, left that job months ago, but my last two jobs were in as a K through 12 education reporter. And I think, you know, talking to a lot of people on the beat, that's the biggest fear, right? The biggest fear for them is to cover mass shooting. And obviously, you know, while it wasn't on the education beat, that was something that you know, ended up doing. And I'm curious kind of if you're willing to talk about it, how you kind of came over that fear to, you know, produce the best work that you can. And, you know, kind of going along with what we were just talking about here, you know, what things you were doing during this coverage, right, to keep yourself, you know, as mentally healthy as you can be, right, in order, again, to really just do the best coverage you can on this topic.
Yeah, a few things come to mind. One, I did find that being able to report can sometimes help me, like writing it all out and feeling like I'm doing something and not just being like helpless to this like horrible situation can sometimes really be the thing that helps kind of get you out of it, having to work and having to process in that way and feeling productive about what you're doing, that this might help or this might change something. I don't know if that's like super healthy of me as a coping mechanism, but I did find that was helpful. I also, actually, when I started covering Sutherland Springs, became this really amazing phenomenon where newspapers who had covered mass shootings were sending care packages to newspapers that were in the middle of it. And I remember when we were covering it, people from the Orlando Sentinel who had just covered the Pulse nightclub shooting sent us this really beautiful care package with letters and like self-care notes and like stress balls and t-shirts. And I was so touched by that. And I remember just like feeling just a lot more connected, you know, that I wasn't alone and that our newsroom wasn't alone and that this is something that reporters everywhere have gone through and we're going through. And I connected with a reporter at the Orlando Sentinel, and we started this Facebook group called Journalists Covering Trauma so that we could all kind of talk about what it was like. It's gotten better, but even at that time, there still were not a lot of like awareness about the trauma that reporters experience and mental health resources and how to find that balance in covering. So that Facebook page was kind of meant as a way for us all to talk and have that conversation. And I found that to be really helpful too. So for me, I think it was just the work itself and then like community, you know, feeling that sense of, even if it's just like with friends or family or other people who have gone through that, that was really helpful to me.
Who's next? Pass the mic back, please.
All right. I'm Julian Rapper with the Boston Globe. I want to ask you about the Danielle Kelly story. You mentioned it was the most ethically challenging story that you've done in your career, and I think that's obviously something that we should probably talk more about, ethics. I think it's like very underspoken about. I can imagine it's very difficult to kind of like find the correct narrative for that story, right? I mean, there are a lot of choices that have to be made about what to include, what not to include, how you're going to shape the story, you know, how you're going to frame it. Can already imagine some of the comments that people probably left, you know, because you're humanizing somebody who's part of somebody else's life who did something that was obviously, you know, horrific. Tell me a little bit about like making those decisions, you know, how you chose to frame the narrative. Did you have doubts about how you were framing it? Those types of things.
You know, I completely agree with you that we don't talk about that stuff enough. And, you know, I think journalism has also evolved a lot. Like there used to be this very hard and sense understanding of what objective reporting is. And this idea that like there's one narrative and that's the narrative and the right narrative. And I think we've like come to learn, hopefully more and more, That there's obviously not just one way to tell a story, and the often like ideas of what that one way is has been based on old white men running newsrooms for decades. And so, talking about diversity and stuff, that's a classic example of that, right? And how ways that we can all help complicate those narratives. About that story specifically, that I don't even know what to say. I mean, I was even torn about whether we should write it at certain points, because you're interviewing someone who's not fully processed what has happened and is in the middle of like this huge mental break, mental even when we're interviewing people right after a mass shooting, like people are in shock. Like, you wonder if sometimes if they even remember what they said to you, and yet here we are expected to turn out these daily stories, getting immediate reactions from people who just lost like their children in a horrific way. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any story necessarily that's the perfect story. And I don't think there's ever exactly one way. I tried to do the best I could to show how she felt while also kind of explaining to the reader, like almost very directly, like how soon this was of an interview after what had happened, and how, if I did this interview now, I'm sure it would be different. And if I did it 10 years from now, I'm sure it would be very different. And so I think what's often helpful, and I've been trying to do more of in stories, is just being more transparent with readers too about the decisions we're making, to help at least show like, look, this is the situation, this is the decision we made, and this is, then here's the outcome of that.
Who's next? Pass the mic along.
I just wanted to why did you turn it off? Just kidding. Thank you for being here and hanging out with us and spending some time. I'm Sarah Al-Bashbishi, work for Mountain State Spotlight, which is a nonprofit in West Virginia. I have a question about kind of process around how you went into working on the series and working on some of these longer investigative pieces, both maybe about your process. How do you like handle, or how do you organize, just like, especially going back to like previous reporting on some of the stuff, like the best ways you found that like to organize your thoughts and stuff while you're working through these things that take, you're not turning it for the next day, but like you're working over time. And whether or not you learned, like you wish you had done certain things during those series that you didn't, that you might implement later.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think organization is my strong suit in general. I will say, like, I've always found chronology really helpful. So during my research and reporting, having like a Google Doc or Word document that's just dedicated to writing like the history leading up to the present and then potential future. Sometimes there's literally a whole section in a story that is that chronology, that's literally just that turned into a narrative form, like explaining the history of how something came to happen. Other times it's just like an amazingly helpful reference point to constantly go back to, wait, what year was that? Wait, did that happen before that? Like, because you're crafting a narrative, so you need to have like a strong sense of the time of what happened when. And so having just like a separate document with a chronology I found is really helpful. Having a document that's just all the sources I've already contacted, sources I'd hope to contact soon, and then like dream sources, like people who would be like, this would be the gold mine to find, like brainstorming that like on its own, I found is really helpful. That both with people and also just with like documents, like physical things that you would like to get a hold of. And then the rest I think is like, sometimes I'll flag like really when I'm going through a transcript or writing out stories, like I'll always bold or flag like the strongest quotes. Sometimes I'll even just pull those out into a separate document to remind me if they, and it's not just quotes, even just like concepts or ideas like that I want to make sure come out in the story and don't want to forget, that help add a complicated narrative. Yeah, things like that, if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, it is. Thank you.
Who's next?
Let me turn it on for you.
I'm Brandon Tinsley with Capital B News. And actually, one of our inaugural editors came from the Washington Post. Yeah, Simone.
Yes, she was my editor for
Oh, really? Oh,
hot
awesome.
second.
Yeah. A question I have is, it's similar to what Aditi was asking about. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about sort of like the creation or the pitching of projects, either ones that you've worked on or just your experience with seeing sort of successful projects come about in the newsroom. But like how, Capital B, like we're so tiny. And so I'm thinking about what is the most like sort of effective way to sort of pitch a package of stories that you think could be, really impactful.
Yeah. So I've seen pitches that have been successful and then ones that haven't. And one thing I've learned is that getting buy-in from leadership from the very beginning is super important. So there was a project like 2 years ago that me and a group of colleagues really wanted to work on. And we kind of started to try to do it from a ground up approach. And it basically did not come to fruition. It ended up being like a much smaller version of what it could have been. And so what I took away from that is like, you need to find, if you're trying to put this project that may involve multiple teams and a fair amount of resources together, like getting buy-in from the top or the highest up you can get is super important. Because once you can get those people up here on board, then it's like everything else can kind of fall into place, right? And when you're asking for more time to do something or asking to travel to go somewhere, like these people up here are already aware of that. And, a lot of times, at least at the Post, there's a hierarchy of editors, right? So the editors that I'm working with are also responding to demands of their leadership. And sometimes things that come to you, it's not really about you, it's because they're under pressure from people above them. And so being able to get that kind of higher in buy-in, making friends and allies that are higher up in the organization, I found can go a long way. And then also just writing out memos. That was a practice that is kind of common at the Post that I had never really seen before, of like writing out a one-page memo about the concept of the project, what the stories would be. Like having something concrete like that can usually help move things along too.
I didn't mean to start that. I'm so sorry.
Hi. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. I think just before I ask my question,
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. Nusrat with the Detroit Free Press. Just hearing you talk about your experience and just navigating talking to families after school shootings was really important, because something that I've kind of been obsessively thinking about so I don't cover shootings. I'm, beat reporter at the Free Press, but I've gotten pulled into mass shooting coverage twice already. And it's just been like, I need several weeks to like recover. And I feel bad saying that, like I'm a reporter, who is covering it, like not a family member affected, but like just hearing you talking about just how you've like, how thoughtfully you think about that has been really impactful, because I also think about that because it just like affects me every time I have to do it. And it's sad to think about the fact that like I'm going to have to think about the next time, that I have to cover, I get pulled in to cover a mass shooting. But my question is also a process related question. So as someone who works on these bigger projects, how do you maintain I guess the confidence in the initial pitch? Because I'm working on a bigger project right now, and there's a deadline I have to meet, so I have that fire under me, and I was excited about it when I pitched it, but now I'm in the phase where I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, why did I pitch this? And now I have a deadline and like, grant money, and like I can't do this anymore, right? So like, how do you like get through that like fear and lack of confidence?
I totally know what you're talking about. I feel like every story has that phase where you're like, you learned so much, you feel like you know nothing. Like the narrative is lost and you're just like, this is just a lot of information. It doesn't add up to anything. For me, I think everyone's different. For me, I need to like verbally talk about it with my editor or with like a coworker. Like I need to like re-explain. And the best editors too will hype you back up. You can't always get great editors. I know that can be an issue, but like the best editors are people who will then like be like, no, what? That's fascinating. You know, when you say stuff and you're like, oh, really? Right. I forgot it, because it's not fascinating to me anymore after like looking at it for a month. So for me, it's like, it's orally, like it's talking about it to a friend or a coworker or editor. I'm trying to think like what other tools you could have to get through that. Maybe if you read like a similar series or work that you would be like, oh, wow, that was really impressive. And that's exactly the kind of thing I want to do with this, you know, to just reignite. I don't know if that, like, I think everyone's been there. That still happens to me now. I think it's just a matter of figuring out, like, where is that place that you can go to, that person or thing that can, like, kind of help remind you of why what you're doing is important. Because I'm sure it still is. I think you're probably just been inundated with information now and, like, lost the plot, you know? But I also just wanted to add really quickly, like, thank you for those kind words about, you know, what I was saying about the effects of covering that stuff. But I think it's good that it's hard for you, you know? Like, I always worry about getting to a place where I don't emotionally react. I think that's the scary part, right? Like, when reporters no longer feel that when you're covering real people's lives. Like, we should always have that much empathy, you know, and have that much care about what we're doing to feel some of, sorry, I shouldn't tap my mic, but like to feel some of that.
I'm going to ask you, since we've been talking a lot about pivoting today, when I started out in a newsroom in 1986, I knew then and still know today that I never wanted to be a manager. I didn't want to sit in meetings all day. I didn't want to, you know, have the title of managing editor or whatever. So it was very clear to me, and I have no regrets about that. But I wonder if management has ever been something that you've thought about, if it's something that you would think about, say 5-10 years from now.
So I think I'm in your camp, at least for right now. I got into this because I love the reporting and writing process, and I feel the same way that being in meetings and you know, doing some of that higher level stuff, at least for now, is not something I'm interested in. I do love mentorship though, and working with students. In my capacity with NHJ, like I love those moments when we're able to connect with kind of the next generation of journalists. And so if it was like a management position that really leaned on that, I think I would love to do it. But I can't say that being an editor, at least for right now, is something that I still love going out into communities and talking to people and hearing their life stories and learning something new from them about it.
The importance, though, of gatekeepers. I don't know the full situation at the Post. Robin Gavon is a good friend. Lori Montgomery at the business desk. We all came up at the Detroit Free Press. So I know quite a few people at the Post, and have known quite a few. But I wonder if the issue of having people who look like us making the decisions is something that you've thought about and maybe thought, I could do good if I were the head of the investigative team or whatever. Have you ever put yourself in that position? Or have I just planted something?
I've definitely experienced the value of it. Just the other day, there was a story in the Washington Post that had a headline about an undocumented immigrant that a bunch of us Latino reporters started messaging about that we didn't feel comfortable with. And we went to one of the only I think she's one of 2 Latina editors at the Washington Post, and explained to her, what the situation was, and she was able to fix it. And I remember thinking like, oh God, thank God we have her, we feel very comfortable. You don't want to be that, there's always that tension of like, I don't want to be the radical in the room, who's like pushing for something and ready to get angry about something, but at the same time, like really feeling like this is wrong. And so having her there and feeling that sense of comfort and safety and being able to say, hey, like this thing is up. Like we've seen other news outlets that have written this responsibly. Like we think the headline should be changed and this amount of context needs to be added to it. It was about the undocumented immigrant who killed a woman that the Trump campaign has used. And anyway, it's obviously a very sensitive subject. And like having her there really showed me I was so grateful in that moment. And there have been so many other moments like that, where you have that person that you can rely on. But I can also understand at institutions where there's so few editors of color, why it's also a scary position to step into, like, do I want to be the only Latina in a room?
The reason I mention it is because one of our speakers from the first Widening class, Jamila Robinson, is now editor of Bon Appetit, but she, was the food editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer. So she sat in on all the morning meetings, and so there was a disturbance or uprising or whatever you want to call it in Philadelphia, and buildings were damaged, windows broken or whatever. And one crusty old copy editor came up with the headline that buildings matter too. And, total play on Black Lives Matter. And she told them, this is wrong. She was the only woman of color in the room or whatever. And she said, y'all are making a huge mistake. You shouldn't do it, whatever. She had to make the decision of whether to die on that hill, decide that that's going to be the thing. And she chose to let them learn, and sure enough, they learned. And it was a really messy, awful situation. And you're right. Being the only woman of color in the room, telling them, look, you're messing up, and having them not listen, it's a no-win proposition. And so that brings me to the Adelante Academy at NAHJ. And so we have now 4 Latina women journalists in the room right now. I want you to talk about why it was developed and how you think it'll be a part of possibly the solution or something moving forward.
So that was developed by the national organization. So I'm with the DC chapter and was not part of the formation of that. But my understanding, and I actually had a colleague who went through it, is it's about creating the pipeline and tools for the next generation and for Latinas in high editing positions. I think a lot of times recruiting work in journalism is about students, right, and getting people into entry-level positions. But what you really need to kind of have the trickle-down structural effect of change, right, is to have folks, especially like in mid-career positions, being able to take that step into higher level management positions. And that program is really geared at folks in those mid-level positions and kind of getting them set up to become the next editors-in-chief and things like that.
Where's the mic? No, we got to get you on recording.
Hi, my name's Maher. I'm at Al Jazeera, and I just had a question about what you said earlier about making those connections at the top to have buy-in for like bigger stories and bigger projects. So I wanted to ask you, how did you go about doing that? What's the most successful way of doing that without overstepping boundaries within your team or within your direct or with your direct supervisor? How do you organically build those relationships at the top?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one, is like finding your allies or finding people. For example, like there were editors who were involved in hiring me that I tried to keep in touch with, that we got coffee with. Actually, Lori was one of those people, and she leads the business desk now. But every once in a while, we'll still kind of catch up. So I think, well, one, like the Latino editors, for example, there's kind of like a special connection. We go to like our affinity groups events together. And so there's kind of like a more just natural like affinity and trust there. Apart from that, I think some of it is just like cold emailing people and asking to get coffee or asking to get lunch. If you do have a specific project, then maybe you can ask your direct editor, like, hey, can we get so-and-so in a room and talk to them about it all together? They can be kind of that bridge if they're on board with it. Yeah, I think there's kind of different avenues to do that. And so I would just find kind of which one seems the most natural to you. Mm-hmm.
Another question from Julie, and pass the mic back.
It's on. I want to talk to you too about going from being a local reporter to a national reporter. I mean, I can imagine the news gathering is very different, like source building is very different. The timelines of your stories, like you mentioned, the way you can build relationships is different. I guess what do you see as like the biggest changes, especially since, you might have to like quote unquote parachute into like communities, right, that you're not familiar with, and you're kind of extracting something that if you're a local reporter, you live there, right? Like, people, you can follow up, like you mentioned before. How do you kind of deal with those differences? How does that manifest itself?
So I would actually say it's mostly not that different. Like a lot of the same things that you would do for your local school board, you do for the Department of Education. You do like it's a lot. It's really is covering City Hall. Like you can cover a lot of the big federal agencies here with that kind of experience. I in my experience, right, I can only speak for myself, but I found a lot of that is actually very similar and translatable. It's just on a bigger scale. Maybe there's slightly different rules, but like the day-to-day work is like pretty similar. There is the issue of parachuting. That is a big difference, right? So when you're covering breaking news, you come in and maybe you leave after a few days. What I've tried to do and have been able to do is like, sometimes you can go back if you become a reporter on this story, pitch another story and see if they'll let you go back there. Like for the Uvalde mass shooting, I went initially when it happened, and then I think I went about 4 weeks later to do a story about this group of mothers who come from a history of Chicana activism in South Texas that were now kind of at the forefront of activism there. And so I did like a story tying in this kind of old civil rights era movement and how the children and grandchildren of those people were now the ones like fighting for change there now. And so that allowed me to go back and kind of not feel like I was just doing the breaking news stuff, but able to continue a little bit. Honestly, the main difference I experienced was like going from local news to the Washington Post is just a lot more reader feedback is a nice way to put it. The Washington Post has like a brand and a name that people feel strongly about, and it has become in recent years like very political and politicized.
Really? I hadn't heard that.
Yeah. And so just, when you're a local reporter, at least I found like people didn't put you in kind of a political box because you're still kind of like a hometown paper. And so there was some of that, I'm not going to lie, but it was still, your paper is still also just covering events in town that people want to read about. And so moving to the Washington Post, I found it was in some ways harder to get a hold of people because they have they feel a certain way about the kind of work your newspaper does. And then just like the amount of engagement from readers, the comments, the emails, the like tweets at you, like that was a little tougher. But Yeah, I mean, in other ways, though, there are doors that open when you're a Washington Post reporter that as a local reporter don't open for you. Like people high up in government and stuff have an interest in talking with you or slipping information to you that they might not otherwise. So it kind of, there's pros and cons, you know.
Last call for questions before I close us out.
I kind of want to ask you more about what you do after covering mass shootings. You know, a lot of what you said about having nightmares or this or that really resonated with me. And after Uvalde, I don't know if I ever want to cover another one. So yeah, just, you know, like what do you do for yourself? Like what resources you seek, you know, after covering that would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on a little bit. For me, community is a big one. So being able to spend time with friends, families, coworkers, especially like ones that covered it with me, worked on those stories with me. Like it's always, even now, like whenever we're in a room together with those people that worked on these stories, like there's just something special about it because we all went through it together. And we were also very privileged and unique in that we took a lot. We already knew going in and had the time to prepare for the toll that it would take on our mental health. And so we did like a lot of kind of novel to me, intentional things to help mitigate that. Like we would schedule meetings with an intentional like 15-minute breather before the hour ended, like 45 minutes with the understanding that if people have meetings starting at the end of the hour, like you would have 15 minutes to kind of like collect your thoughts and transition before you have to go into a meeting that's like completely unrelated and like act cheery and normal again, you know? So we also did things like that were really helpful in just getting through it. But I also have like, I love music. I have like a guitar and stuff like that. So I also have like creative outlets that I tried to use like completely outside of work to just help process.
I'm going to ask you a question that stems from that young Rachel who wanted to win a Pulitzer and wind up at the New York Times and the Washington Post. At this stage of your life and your career, where do you go after the Washington Post? I mean, do you stay there for the rest of your career? Because, you know, where could you possibly go that matches that? Or what are your plans for Silvia 10 years from now?
You're asking like the biggest existential question of my life right now. I wish I knew. I'm trying to figure that out. I genuinely, I wish I could like make up something, but I don't know. I've been trying to figure out what that looks like. I have been thinking about just like other forms of journalism, you know, like what are other ways that we can reach people with our stories in this like evolving landscape, and what are ways that I can use my skills and in a different way, you know, but still doing the main core things that I love. And so, yeah, I think the question is always like deciphering like what can I do that still keeps these core things that I'm so passionate about and that really like light the fire under me, while pivoting kind of the mediums or ways that you do it, to keep things interesting.
Last question, I promise. And that is, we've talked a lot today about how as journalists, we need to keep a sort of a balanced perspective about the next 4 years, because it could be scary, or we could take our personal opinions about, oh my God, the world's on fire, into reporting. So what advice do you want to give the Widening Fellows about the opportunities of covering the next 4 years and how to keep their equilibrium?
Oh, that's a big question. I think, you know, as we go into this whole new era, there will have to be a recalibration of coverage. But I think also we're going to have to, I think the main point is to like really stay true to the heart of what we do, you know, and if facts and truth are our mission, to stay true, and fairness is to stay true to that, right? And one of the dangers that we've seen with the previous administration is weakness in journalism, and an easy solution in journalism that's wrong is to create this like both sides effect, right? Where we're trying to kind of weigh or show these points of view equally when we know that the facts are on one side and not the other. And so I think really keeping that in mind is super important. And that may involve having to have tough conversations in your newsroom about it, because our newsrooms aren't perfect. And I hope we've learned from the past several years and how to cover the Trump administration and the best way to do that. I also think, like, especially as journalists of color, like, we need to take really good care of ourselves. It could be a really challenging time. And just to keep in mind that, like, our differences and our perspectives, like, really matter and are valuable. And there may be moments where it feels like the tide or the status quo is telling you otherwise. And to just, like, find your people and stick strong, because, like, what you're bringing and the unique backgrounds you have is, like, so critical and important in our journalism. And especially during times like these, like, this is when those voices are so important.
Well, we have been tremendously privileged to have you join us today and share your experiences and insights. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Silvia Foster-Frau of the Washington Post for joining us.